Mason Porter thought he had found the love of his life in Emily Wade, a kind, warm-hearted preschool teacher with a laugh that lit up every room. But behind the scenes, Mason's mother, Lorraine Porter, was quietly unraveling. Beneath her polished exterior and charming smile lived an obsession so deep it would end in murder. Not out of jealousy, not out of rage, but because she believed Emily was too fat to marry her son. Everyone in the quiet town of Crest Hill admired the love story between Mason Porter and Emily Wade. From the outside, they looked like a couple straight out of a fairy tale. Mason was a mild-mannered software engineer with a calm voice and steady hands. Emily, a preschool teacher, had a laugh that made children feel safe and a heart big enough to carry the weight of everyone's troubles. Their relationship grew, slowly and sincerely, starting as college friends, then evolving into something deeper over the years. When Mason proposed on a quiet Sunday morning, no one was surprised. Everyone said it was about time. Everyone, except Lorraine Porter. Lorraine had always seen herself as a perfect mother. She raised Mason alone after her husband's fatal accident when Mason was only 4. She kept a meticulous home, cooked healthy meals, and took pride in her reputation as a strong, resilient woman. To the outside world, she was a picture of grace under pressure. But behind the smiles and carefully arranged decor, Lorraine had rigid ideas about what her life and her son's should look like. And Emily didn't match that picture. Emily wasn't what Lorraine considered a proper match. It wasn't her job or her manners. It was her weight. Lorraine never said the word out loud, but everything about her behavior screamed discomfort. She frowned slightly when Emily entered the room, offered her salads while others ate pasta, and commented on her bravery for wearing certain outfits. Emily noticed but chose kindness in return. She believed, or at least hoped, that Lorraine would soften with time, but Lorraine didn't soften. In fact, the engagement seemed to push her over the edge. She began to insert herself into the wedding planning process, claiming she wanted to help, but criticizing every detail Emily chose. The floral arrangements were too loud, the invitations were too plain, and the dress Emily loved was, in Lorraine's words, unflattering for her shape. Emily stayed polite, often walking away from conversations on the verge of tears. Mason tried to mediate, but he was caught in an impossible position, torn between the woman he loved and the mother who raised him. As the wedding day drew closer, the strain grew unbearable. Emily's once joyful attitude dimmed. She began second-guessing her choices, wondering if marrying Mason meant inheriting a lifetime of criticism. Meanwhile, Lorraine took small actions that chipped away at Emily's confidence. She accidentally left diet books around the house, made backhanded compliments, and even hinted to family members that Emily might not be ready for the commitment marriage demanded. What no one realized was how deep Lorraine's hatred had become. It wasn't just a mother-in-law's disapproval. It was something darker, an internal war between her obsession with appearances and the reality she couldn't control. She believed Emily was ruining everything she had worked for: the image of a perfect family, the legacy of a respectable life, the illusion of control. Lorraine began retreating into herself, spending long hours alone in her study. She stopped going to her book club, canceled social lunches, and spoke to Mason less frequently. When she did speak, it was cold and clipped. She was silent but watching, distant but calculating. While others were planning seating charts and writing toasts, Lorraine was quietly building resentment strong enough to destroy, and no one saw it coming. Lorraine's dislike for Emily didn't fade with time. It festered. What began as subtle judgment slowly transformed into a fixation. Lorraine started believing that Emily wasn't just unsuitable for Mason, but a genuine threat to the life she had built around her son. For decades, Lorraine had devoted herself entirely to Mason's well-being. She had sacrificed her own social life, turned down promotions, and focused on crafting a future where her son would thrive. But now, in her mind, that future was under attack by a woman she viewed as weak, sloppy, and undeserving. She spent her evenings scrolling through Emily's social media accounts, fixating on every photo, every caption, every comment. Lorraine zoomed in on images, making cruel observations to herself about Emily's posture, her outfits, her smile. She convinced herself she was seeing signs of laziness, of poor discipline, of someone who didn't take herself seriously. She didn't care about Emily's kindness or her popularity among Mason's friends. She didn't care about how much Emily loved her son. All Lorraine could see was imperfection, and to her, that was unforgivable. Soon, she began documenting her observations. In a small spiral notebook she kept hidden behind books in her study, Lorraine started writing down everything that bothered her. She recorded what Emily wore to family dinners, how many servings she took, whether she mentioned exercise. The entries were written in neat, almost obsessive handwriting, and they grew more detailed over time. Lorraine began analyzing Emily like a case study, convinced that if she gathered enough proof, she could somehow present it to Mason and open his eyes. But Mason wasn't interested in dissecting his fiancée's behavior. He was focused on their future, buying a home, merging their finances, preparing for married life. Whenever Lorraine tried to hint at her concerns, he brushed them off. The more he defended Emily, the more isolated Lorraine felt. She started believing Mason had been manipulated, that Emily had somehow turned him against her. In Lorraine's distorted mind, her son was slipping away, not because of adulthood, but because of Emily's influence. Isolation only made her obsession worse. She stopped seeing her friends, quit attending church, and rarely left the house. Except for errands. The quiet suburban streets that once gave her comfort now felt empty and cold. The silence fed her thoughts. She began reading blogs and forums about controlling relationships, but twisted the information to fit her narrative. In her view, it wasn't Emily who was the victim, it was her. She was the one being pushed out, overlooked, abandoned. One day, Lorraine visited a local nutritionist under the guise of seeking advice for a young woman in her care. She asked probing questions about metabolism, weight-related illness, and how certain foods could affect the body if consumed over time. She didn't take notes, but she remembered everything. When she left the clinic, she stopped by the pharmacy and picked up a bottle of supplements the nutritionist had briefly mentioned, meant to aid digestion. She told herself she was just doing research, but in truth, something darker was forming in her mind. She began imagining scenarios. What if Emily got sick? What if she couldn't make it to the wedding? What if she just disappeared? These thoughts started as passing curiosities, but slowly became plans. Not fully formed, not yet concrete, but dangerously close. Lorraine wasn't just fantasizing about a future without Emily. She was preparing for it, and no one noticed the change. Mason was too busy at work. Emily, still hopeful, continued trying to win Lorraine over. And Lorraine, always composed on the outside, smiled through it all, while hiding a storm that was rapidly approaching. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything fell apart. On an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, Emily left the preschool where she worked, waving goodbye to her students and humming a song under her breath. She had dinner plans with Mason and had even picked up a little surprise for him, a small framed photo of their engagement, which she planned to give him that night. She never made it home. Her car was found the next morning in the parking lot of a grocery store just a few blocks from her apartment. The driver's side door was unlocked, her purse was on the passenger seat, and her phone sat in the cup holder. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Just silence. The last text Emily sent was to Mason. It simply said, "I'm so sorry." That message turned the entire investigation upside down. Some believed she had cold feet and decided to run. Others feared something terrible had happened. Her friends and family immediately dismissed the idea that she had left on her own. Emily was excited about her wedding, her students, and her life. She had no known issues with depression or anxiety. She had just renewed her lease and ordered personalized thank you cards for the reception. There were no signs of hesitation until that final, haunting message. Police reviewed nearby surveillance cameras. One grainy clip from a gas station next to the grocery store showed Emily's car pulling into the lot at 5:42 p.m. A shadowy figure appeared to approach the driver's side, but the angle and lighting made it impossible to identify the person. Still, something about the figure felt oddly familiar to Mason. He couldn't explain it, but the way the person walked, the outline of the body, it triggered something unsettling. He mentioned this to the detectives, and they slowed down the footage frame by frame. The person wore a dark jacket and gloves, even though it was a warm evening. When the investigators enhanced the image, they caught a brief flash of the jacket's back, stitched with a subtle floral pattern. Mason recognized it. Lorraine had worn that same jacket to a brunch the week before. When questioned, Lorraine claimed she had been home that evening. She said she had spoken to a friend on the phone and made dinner for herself. But when police contacted the friend, she couldn't confirm the call. Lorraine had left a vague voicemail that evening, but never actually spoke to anyone. Her dinner was a microwave meal found still uneaten in the trash. The alibi was flimsy, but there was no physical evidence linking her to Emily's disappearance. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no GPS data. Just a feeling, a strong, cold feeling that something wasn't right. Mason tried to stay strong, but the weight of it all crushed him. He couldn't sleep. He stopped going to work. He spent hours driving through neighborhoods, checking alleyways and abandoned lots, begging for any trace of her. Her disappearance made local headlines, then slowly faded from the news cycle. Volunteers organized searches, candlelight vigils were held, but Emily remained missing. Days turned into weeks, and hope dwindled. Lorraine attended the vigils, sometimes even helping organize them. She stood beside Mason, placing her hand gently on his shoulder and speaking to reporters with a steady voice. She called Emily a sweet girl and claimed to be praying for her safe return. No one suspected the grieving mother. No one questioned the tears that came too easily or the composure that never wavered. Behind closed doors, Lorraine's home was spotless as ever. But something had changed. She no longer mentioned the wedding. She took down the framed photo of Mason and Emily from her mantel. And late at night, when the lights were off and the windows were shut, she sat alone in her study, staring at nothing. Autumn crept into Crest Hill with a quiet chill, casting long shadows across Lorraine's neighborhood. Leaves gathered in neat piles on the sidewalks, untouched by her rake for the first time in years. The town had mostly returned to its routine, but for Mason, nothing was the same. He no longer smiled when passing the bakery where he and Emily used to stop for coffee. He ignored the emails from work, avoided calls from friends, and barely spoke during the rare visits to his mother's home. He was living in limbo, waiting for an answer that never came. Then, one morning in late October, a local landscaper was assigned to trim the overgrown brush along the back edge of Lorraine's property. It was a job she had scheduled months before but never canceled, and when he arrived, she wasn't home. As he moved through the dense shrubs, pulling weeds and turning soil, his shovel hit something hard. At first, he assumed it was just a stone, until the second hit revealed something pale beneath the dirt. Boned out, he stepped back in shock and called the police immediately. Within an hour, the quiet street was filled with squad cars in yellow tape. Neighbors watched from their porches as investigators moved in and set up tents over the garden behind Lorraine's house. What they found buried under an old stone birdbath stunned even the most seasoned officers. Human remains, partially wrapped in a thin bedsheet, severely decomposed but intact enough for identification. The dental records confirmed the impossible. The body belonged to Emily Wade. The police quickly secured the property and obtained a search warrant for the house. Inside, they found what seemed at first like nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was clean, organized, perfectly staged. But a closer inspection revealed small, chilling details. In the fireplace, investigators found remnants of charred fabric and melted plastic, later identified as fragments of Emily's handbag. In a locked drawer of Lorraine's desk, they discovered the spiral notebook. The same notebook where she had meticulously documented Emily's clothing, habits, and weight-related observations was now filled with increasingly erratic entries. In one passage, she had written, "He'll never understand that I did this for him. He won't see now, but he will thank me later." Another entry read, "I had no choice." She wouldn't have left on her own. She was too proud. The most disturbing piece of evidence came from an old mobile phone recovered from a shoebox under Lorraine's bed. The device hadn't been used in over a year, but one audio recording had been saved on it, an accidental capture that appeared to be from the night of Emily's disappearance. In the recording, muffled sounds of dragging, heavy breathing, and the scraping of metal could be heard. At one point, Lorraine's voice whispered, "You don't belong here. You were never going to fit." Lorraine was arrested at a local grocery store that same afternoon, clutching a shopping list and smiling at the cashier as though nothing had happened. When officers placed her in handcuffs, she didn't resist. She only asked if Mason had been told yet. Her face remained unreadable during questioning, her voice calm, her eyes blank. The town erupted in disbelief. People who had known Lorraine for years couldn't imagine her capable of such a thing. But the evidence was overwhelming, and soon, her composure cracked. Though she never confessed directly, her silence spoke volumes. Her attorney claimed diminished capacity, that Lorraine had acted under the delusion that she was protecting her son. But behind the defense strategies and court proceedings was a brutal truth. Lorraine had killed Emily with calculated precision and buried her in the soil she once tended with pride. What was once a beautiful garden had become a grave, hiding the darkest secret of Crest Hill. The trial began 5 months after Emily's remains were found. The courtroom was filled with people from all over Crest Hill, many of whom had once admired Lorraine Porter. They sat in silence as the evidence was presented. The notebook filled with obsessive entries, the burnt remnants of Emily's belongings, the haunting audio recording, and the final blow, the forensic confirmation that Emily had died from blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by a heavy gardening tool found washed and stored neatly in Lorraine's shed. Lorraine sat motionless through most of the proceedings. Her gray suit was carefully pressed, her hair pinned back, her expression unreadable. She never cried. Not during the coroner's testimony, not when Emily's mother took the stand, not even when the photos of the shallow grave were shown. She stared forward, hands folded in her lap, as if watching a play that had nothing to do with her. Mason didn't sit in the family row. He stayed in the very back of the courtroom, avoiding his mother's gaze. When he testified, his voice broke. Only once, when he described how happy Emily had been just days before she vanished. He admitted he had ignored signs, downplayed the tension, assumed his mother's coldness was just overprotectiveness. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and it showed in every sentence he spoke. He finished his testimony without looking at Lorraine. The defense attempted to paint a picture of a woman who had lost touch with reality, who believed she was protecting her son from a life of misery. They brought in a psychologist who testified about Lorraine's rigid personality, her history of obsessive behavior, and her possible narcissistic delusions. But the prosecution tore through the narrative with one clear point. None of that changed the fact that Lorraine had made deliberate choices. She had waited until Emily was alone, lured her to the garden under false pretenses, and ended her life with a calculated blow. There was no evidence of a mental breakdown, just a long, quiet descent into cruelty. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Lorraine Porter was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no reaction from Lorraine as the sentence was read. No outburst, no breakdown. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked out of the courtroom with the same calm that had carried her through the trial. The aftermath left Crest Hill shaken. Local news ran stories for weeks. Neighbors who once attended Lorraine's dinner parties avoided her house entirely. Some said they had always sensed something was off about her, while others simply couldn't reconcile the woman they knew with the monster described in court. The garden behind her home was removed entirely. Every flower, every bush, every stone. The new owners paved it over with concrete, unwilling to live above what had been a burial site. Mason left Crest Hill shortly after the sentencing. He packed his things in silence and didn't say goodbye to many people. He took a job out of state and never returned. He never visited his mother in prison. Emily's family created a foundation in her name, offering scholarships to young women pursuing early childhood education. Her memory lived on not just in classrooms and awards, but in the hearts of everyone she had touched. But the story stayed in the town's bones. It was told in hushed voices, behind closed doors, passed down like folklore. Because what happened wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder that hatred doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it grows slowly, hidden, beneath politeness and clean windows. And sometimes it kills without ever raising its voice.